The ancient Near Eastern world was a place governed by strict tribal laws, powerful kings, and solemn agreements that dictated the boundaries of nations and the fate of generations. In those days, a man's word was bound by blood, and breaking a sacred oath meant inviting absolute destruction upon his entire household and lineage. During a period of intense vulnerability and quiet questioning, an elderly man named Abram sat in his tent, looking at his empty arms and wondering about his legacy. He had left his homeland, his family, and his inheritance under a divine command, yet he still possessed no child to carry his name into the unknown future. It was in this precise moment of absolute silence and human limitation that the sovereign Lord decided to step into his reality, establishing an unbreakable covenant that would alter the course of human history forever. The word of the Lord came to Abram in a magnificent supernatural vision, breaking through his heavy anxieties with a voice of absolute peace and divine authority. According to Genesis chapter 15 verse 1, the Lord commanded him not to be afraid, declaring that he was Abram's shield and his exceedingly great reward. But Abram, looking at the physical impossibility of his old age, poured out his honest confusion, questioning how these promises could ever manifest since he remained completely childless. The Creator did not rebuke his fragile human logic. Instead, he led him outside into the crisp, pitch-black desert night and commanded him to look toward the heavens. God told him to count the brilliant stars spinning across the dark canopy, issuing a breathtaking decree that his future descendants would be just as countless as the celestial lights. Abram looked up at the vast, shimmering expanse of the universe, and despite his barren reality, he chose to place his absolute trust in the mouth of the Creator. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 records a monumental shift in spiritual history, stating that he believed in the Lord, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. But the Lord was not finished establishing the legal and spiritual boundaries of this magnificent promise to his chosen servant. He reminded Abram that he was the same God who brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give him this vast land as an inheritance. Abram, desiring a holy anchor for his faith, respectfully asked how he could know with absolute certainty that he would truly possess it. The Lord looked at the patriarch and issued a highly specific, unusual command that would completely set the stage for a terrifying cosmic ceremony, as recorded in verse 9. God did not tell him to build a traditional stone altar or offer a standard sacrifice. He commanded him to bring a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abram understood the solemn cultural meaning of this specific request, as it was the traditional blueprint for a blood covenant known as cutting a treaty. He gathered the animals, brought them before the Lord, and carefully cut each of the larger beasts completely in half down the middle. Abram placed the bloody, divided pieces directly opposite each other on the dry ground, creating a narrow pathway right down the absolute center of the split animals. According to the ancient customs of the land, when two parties made a binding agreement, they would walk side by side through that bloody path. By passing through the pieces, they were making a terrifying declaration, stating that if either party broke the contract, they should be torn apart just like those slaughtered beasts. Abram stood guard by the bloody pathway for hours under the hot sun, driving away the aggressive birds of prey that tried to descend upon the sacred frames. He waited in deep suspense, bracing his heart for the moment when he would walk through the blood next to the invisible presence of the Creator. As the sun began to drop below the desert horizon, a heavy, supernatural event took place that completely paralyzed the physical senses of the waiting patriarch. Genesis chapter 15, verse 12 records that when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. This was not an ordinary physical tiredness, but a divine weight that locked him into a state of total helplessness where he could do absolutely nothing. In the midst of that terrifying, thick darkness, the voice of God shattered the silence, delivering a sweeping prophetic overview of his descendants' future. The Lord revealed that his lineage would be strangers in a foreign land, suffering affliction for 400 years before being brought out with immense wealth. When the darkness reached its absolute peak and the stars were completely hidden by the heavy spiritual atmosphere, a breathtaking event occurred that defied human logic. Verse 17 records that it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there was a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. Abram watched from his paralyzed state as these two mysterious, glowing objects moved majestically down the narrow, bloody path on their own. The smoking oven represented the consuming holiness and cloud of divine presence, while the burning torch represented the brilliant, unquenchable light of the living God. Think about the immense, staggering theological explosion that was taking place within the quiet parameters of this split animal pathway. The burning torch and the smoking oven passed through the blood entirely on their own, while Abram remained frozen on the sidelines as a completely passive observer. In ancient customs, both parties had to walk through the blood to share the mutual responsibility of keeping the oath. But God was altering the rules of history, stepping into the pathway alone to show that the fulfillment of the covenant depended 100% on his unshakable faithfulness, not on human perfection. God was binding himself to the promise, taking the full liability of the contract upon his own sovereign shoulders. Genesis chapter 15, verse 18 concludes this magnificent night encounter, stating that on that very same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, establishing the permanent boundaries of the promised land. God took an elderly, childless wanderer and locked his destiny into an eternal framework that no human empire or demonic force could ever break. The split animals were not a monument of human dedication, but a blueprint of divine sacrifice that pointed directly toward a future event. This stunning revelation shatters our modern ideas of control, reminding us that the promises of God are never sustained by our own fragile human strength. This magnificent historical vision serves as an urgent, burning message of security for your modern life today, especially when you feel overwhelmed by your flaws. There are seasons in our human journey where we look at our mistakes, our failures, and our broken promises and conclude that we have ruined our destiny. We assume that because we stumbled or failed to live up to the standard, God will completely tear up the contract and abandon us in the dark. But the prophetic code of Abram's night vision reminds us that our relationship with the Creator is sustained by His perfection, not our performance. You must stop relying on your own temporary fragile efforts and rest completely in the finished work of the ultimate covenant keeper. Long after Abram's vision, the true burning torch of heaven, Jesus Christ, was broken and split apart on the hill of Calvary to seal an eternal covenant for you. He walked through the ultimate path of blood and took the entire penalty of our brokenness upon his own frame so we could walk entirely free. Rest perfectly in the unshakable assurance that the one who cut the treaty in the dark shadows of history will never fail to bring your life into a glorious fulfillment.